And I'm more nervous because I know how well organized George is and how unorganized I am. That's why we make a good team, George and I.
That's it.
I thought that this really was going to be a discussion, and I was only going to engage in give and take with everyone. So my comments, I hope, will follow Prexi's discipline and be very brief, all too brief and unsatisfactory to me, I can tell you in advance. And in terms of meeting and knowing Eduardo, I am probably the junior partner in this collection of elders, as it were. I first met Eduardo in 1961 at a UNESCO conference in Boston, where I had the pleasure, an amazing pleasure, of sitting next to a very young, very handsome, and very articulate African leader who was speaking on the role of education in creating a new Africa, and how important that was, how that was the major thing. That person turned out to be Eduardo Mondlane. That was the same year, if I remember correctly, and Ed or George or somebody with a much more accurate brain than mine will remind me that I'm off a year or not a year. That was the year we announced at that UNESCO conference the awarding of the Nobel Prize to Chief Luthuli. I didn't get to see Eduardo or get to know the Mondlanes again until I came in the early 60s to Dar es Salaam. When I went to a beach on a Sunday, and there was this beautiful woman with beautiful children, and she said, "Hello, my name is Janet Mondlane." And I sat down next to her and I said, "Oh my God, I met your husband." And got to know them. From that point on, Eduardo Mondlane and the Mondlane family was part of the center of my life. Now, I've been asked, on my last visit to Mozambique, I spoke about Eduardo, and I have to tell you a little negative story. My Portuguese is terrible. So there was someone sitting next to me translating everything I said in English when I spoke about Eduardo. And several times during the translation, I had to pause and correct him. Because every time I said that Eduardo was truly a socialist, it was translated that Eduardo was a Marxist. And I said, I had to stop and say, Eduardo was no more a Marxist than Karl Marx was, when he himself responded to an inquiry by saying, "I believe in what I have written, but I am not myself a Marxist." Eduardo was a great believer in social justice and a great believer in synthesizing things. I think it was George who said he was a reconciler. If I can conceive of anything that may be attached to dialectical materialism, it's the idea that the concept that I think was part of Eduardo's life of the unity of the ability to create the unity of opposites, to recognize it and to get these opposites working together. After all, in certain ways, George and I are opposites, and we've worked together creatively for I don't know how many years. So that I would have to say, if Eduardo was a socialist, I stop for a moment and say he was a socialist humanist. And it was very important to him that that humanist base be there at all times. Not an ideological base, but a human being base. I remember walking back with him from seeing a film at the embassy, the Chinese embassy in Dar es Salaam, and it ended with a tribute to Mao Zedong, and Mao appeared on the balcony and he said, as we walked back, "My God, I could never be like that." Now, he wasn't talking in terms of ideas. He was talking in terms of the centralization of a single figure as the embodiment of everything. He said, "Can you imagine me coming out in what was then Lorenzo Marques on a balcony with a crowd underneath shouting, 'Mondlane, Mondlane'?" He said, "I could never stand it." but his perceptions of how people worked, of how people thought, of what people needed were amazing. Absolutely as perceptive as anyone I had ever met in my life, more perceptive. He knew the needs of people, and he responded to the needs of people. And he knew, although I've been told by people in Mozambique during my visits, that you could never nail Mondlane down because he could think in terms of whoever he was talking to at any given moment. Now, that didn't mean he was a chameleon. It didn't mean he didn't know what he believed in. To me, as I observed it, it meant he was capable of walking in someone else's footsteps and capable of seeing the world as someone else saw it. And therefore, a great reconciler, as George said, because he could bring people together from opposite ends of the spectrum and somehow find a common ground by which they worked together. This was Eduardo Mondlane for me. I'll pause one other small incident. By the time I met Eduardo, I had already been partially, we're going to come back to Fellowship of Reconciliation again, we always do. I had already been partially involved in the movement for civil rights, in the movement for freedom, both in Africa and in the United States. I had completed a film, which I wrote and produced, called Walk to Freedom. And it was about the Montgomery, Alabama bus boycott. And if I remember correctly, it was the first film on Martin Luther King made in America. It was financed, the idea came from, and the funding came from the Fellowship of Reconciliation. And it was made by the Fellowship of Reconciliation. And I had learned through working with them how disparate people who might not agree ideologically could come together and do something. The film was 17 minutes long. Now, if you go back to 1957, 17-minute film was very expensive, but in today's terms, it was nothing. It was 17 minutes long. We produced it for $17,000, which was a large sum of money for FOR, but a very small amount to produce a film. And it went around the world. And that film, called Walk to Freedom, linked the Montgomery, Alabama bus boycott, the Alexandria bus boycott, and the teachings of Mahatma Gandhi. Now, this film, to me, the approach to this film was the common ground on which Eduardo and I connected, not because we talked about the film, but because we discovered that both of us believed in synthesizing, in synergizing, in bringing opposites together, in reconciling among people. And to me, he was the great reconciler. I only have maybe 30 seconds, right? Okay. In 30 seconds, there are 100,000 things I would like to tell you. And I hope that maybe we can open this to discussion and we can kick back and forth. But the Mondlanes have been the major force in my life. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Herb. I also want to mention that your film, Come Back Africa, was one of the pivotal things that influenced me in these things. I want to thank you. We'll hear now from Reverend Ed Hawley.
Well, when Al invited me to be on this panel, I suggested to him I should come last because I actually already had been first. I had the great good fortune to be invited here when the plaque in Peters Hall, just to the north of us here, was dedicated. And I had 20 minutes at that time in which to say what I needed to say about Eduardo. So I am going to try to be quite brief here now. That's all on video someplace, including my losing my place in the pages. If you see Al, he can probably tell you how to find that video, and it's all also available, I think, in photocopy form or something if you do want to know what happened on that occasion. And I hope most of you by now have seen the plaque. If you hadn't, don't leave without going to Peters Hall and seeing the marvelous plaque growing out of all of the work that Al McQueen and the students have done here. Well, all kinds of memories were brought back by what I have been hearing from the other panelists, but I think I am the only one here who first met Eduardo in this place, in Oberlin, Ohio. And I have, I need to express great thanks first to the Reverend Joe King, who was the minister at First Church and gave me the opportunity to come to Oberlin as associate pastor at First Church in 1949, and then to Mildred Randall, who I had known through Pilgrim Fellowship, what was then the Congregational Christian Youth Organization in the Midwest here. And she married Darrell, went to Africa, met Eduardo, knew I was at Oberlin, and wrote to say, here's a man you will want to meet. So perhaps 10 days after he arrived, I went over to Men's Building, which is now Wilder Hall, where he was living, and we became acquainted. And among other things, he told me about this young woman he had met that summer at Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, and he wanted me to meet her, that she was studying down at Western College in Miami and coming up here for a student conference. And Janet, I don't know if you remember, but we met over in a classroom building in what was then the Graduate School of International Studies, and Eduardo began to convince me that here was a relationship that deserved to be enduring, and how right he was. We continued to be friends. I remember visiting him over in the newer dormitories over here in his second year, and then he became homeless after finishing his senior year, and dormitory space was not available for him to stay in, so I said, well, come and stay in my apartment, third floor of a building over on Morgan Street, which he did for that summer before he went to Northwestern. I'd gone to my landlady here in abolitionist Oberlin, interracial Oberlin, said, well, there's a student who would like to stay with me this summer. And 2 weeks later, I learned she had learned who the student was, and she was a little upset with this. But none of the other tenants left the building, as she feared might happen. And instead, of course, Eduardo made good friends all over the place, as he did every place he went. Well, if I continue along this line of personal reminiscences, I won't get to the points I feel must be made, although some of them have been made even better than I could make them by the earlier speakers, about, very briefly, what I feel is Eduardo's legacy and the things that all of us need to try to take from him to build into the coming 21st century as we try to create a world in which people are as united as he envisioned the world might be. Several people have mentioned the FOR and the pacifists. How ironic this is, that out of a commitment to pacifism, reconciliation, should come a liberation leader, one committed to armed struggle, and what a struggle it's been for some of us to try to understand that. And it was a struggle for Eduardo, but he came to feel that there is a point where violence is necessary. And in one of his speeches in 1964 at the World Council of Churches Consultation on Race Relations in Mindolo, Zambia, he asked the help of the Christian community in learning how to use violence without hate, with maximum restraint and discipline, and with the clear goal of establishing a non-racial society guaranteeing justice and dignity for all. So point one is this effort to work toward unity by whatever means necessary, but minimizing the impact of the violence on human beings. Secondly, he was deeply committed to unity, beginning within Mozambique at the interethnic level and seeing what happened in the training camps, schools, and the army to encourage the learning of songs, dances, and stories from the various communities of Mozambique by all Mozambicans is one small example of this. But he dreamed beyond that of Pan-Africanism and African unity and world unity. My first visit with Eduardo in Dar es Salaam, we had arrived in April. Eduardo was away visiting various countries in Europe, including the Soviet Union, and he came back just a few days after the birthday. Am I right? I'm suddenly thinking, do I share that with you, Janet? But anyway, my birthday on May 7th, and yes, and he brought me one of those little Russian dolls you unscrew, and then there's another one inside, you unscrew that, et cetera, which I wish I still had, but I tried to send it home with one of the Mozambican refugees to mail in the States, and it got lost. But in any case, he talked to me about the way in which African socialism needed to draw both from the visions of the West and of the East without appropriating either. And of course, that has been already talked about, but taking what was valid for Africa from whatever source it came, and ultimately hoped for the end of the iron and bamboo curtains and the understanding among all peoples of the world. And the other 2 points, which I'll just make briefly, because I know Prixie's going to start stroking his beard, are the, I gave away the secret.
Gave away the secret. I was doing it so subtly, too.
Are first, his commitment to the absolute equality of women and men. In a continent in which women have in many ways been subservient, Eduardo insisted on the equal place for women in the liberation struggle, and there are many illustrations of that. And then, of course, has been mentioned before, his commitment to education at all levels in order that people might understand one another and understand their world. And as the quote that's often been heard when he resigned from teaching at Syracuse, "Even though I love university life more than anything else in the world, I have decided to dedicate the rest of my life to the liberation struggle." But that struggle included reaching out for the education of the people of Mozambique and the people of the world and the creation of a just society.
Ed, I thank you, and I thank you in so many ways. Many of you wouldn't know this, but let me just mention for a moment that Ed Hawley facilitated my first trip to work for the Mozambique Institute in Frelimo in 1965, and Ed and Gretchen met me, I think, at the Nairobi airport. Took a young, skinny West Side kid from Chicago and helped introduce me to a transformative experience, as they say today. Ambassador Skinner, I don't envy you. In a few minutes, we're going to ask you if in a few minutes you can respond and add to all this presentation. Ambassador Skinner.
Thank you very much, Reverend Nesbitt. I'm quite pleased to have been asked to do the impossible, but I'm a professor at Columbia University in the city of New York, and we try our best. There's a very important theme here which permeates all of the discussions, and that is the question of dream and vision. As a child, of course, I learned the lines from Julius Caesar. And for those of you who remember those lines, there are tides in the affairs of men, we will say people, which when taken at the flood, lead on to fame and fortune. In other words, what we have here then, we have here a man caught up in the tides in the affairs of the world and Africa. An important theme is the role of the missions. Go ye therefore into all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. The missions have played a very important, very often ambiguous role in the way in which the peoples of Africa articulated with the rest of the world. But it was important to understand it was through the missions, by and large, and through the church, that the dispossessed of the world first had a glimpse of a kind of equality. In Christ there is no east or west. Let me stop. They are all precious in his sight. And the missions played a very important role. Dr. Darrell Randall talks about his role, and I'm not quite sure whether he was a missionary or not, but he was involved with the church. The first time I met George Hauser, he looked like a missionary to me. And of course, I had my problems with the missionaries, but so be it. But the missions played an important role. And through the missionaries, black people have obtained the opportunity to liberate themselves. Protestants, but they did use their Protestants, they're protesting against the established order and made it. These individuals, many of them, ended up in the United States. Again, it was no accident that the United States was the Mecca. It had emerged after World War II, after World War I, as the most important nation state. And these individuals were sent here very often by missionaries to the United States, where they could get an education. And they did get an education, not only how to read and write, but to understand the factor of race as an issue which we have not yet resolved in our own society. But race, but what was important is that as one looks at the history of these men, we find that they were able in their personal and intellectual lives to overcome race. And that was a victory which they overcame in the United States, in many cases. In terms of their own evolution, they moved through the colleges, Oberlin, Lincoln, to higher education. It was when Eduardo had come to New York after having gone through Northwestern. He was an anthropologist, but he did not want to acknowledge anthropology. we believed in savages. The sociologists, however, believed in urban folk, modern folks. So he called himself a sociologist. I had no problem with that. I met him at Columbia University when he was working at the UN. That was a very interesting environment. We received visits from everybody. Every important person who came to the UN ended up at the seminar. And of course, we gave them dinner, and then we argued with them. And then myself and Eduardo and others would go over to the West End and over beer would talk about what can be done to liberate Africa. But there were other things going on, not only the UN, but the United States was involved, as you all were told, in a very interesting and very vicious Cold War. And Eduardo could not escape that. I, as 110% American, because I was born in Trinidad, defended the United States. We argued as to whether or not he should go to Germany, Cuba, and get arms from the Soviets. I, as World War II veteran, US Army, did not quite agree. However, we have been told about his lack of ideology, except African ideology. I learned a lot. Even coming here, I learned that he was at a conference in Washington, George Hauser told me, where you had not only Avril Harriman, Soapy Williams, but Wayne Frederick. And that was organized by AMSAC. Well, you young people should know that AMSAC did turn out to be a CIA plant. And those of us who, as young Turks, fought or elders, did not quite know it, but it meant that the United States was even using all of the institutions, including AMSAC, to further its position. It was the first and only time I think that I met Janet. She was there. But again, AMSAC, the UN, I didn't really realize that Eduardo was at that UNESCO conference in Boston. As a young professor, I was there as part of the crowd. So what we have here, my friends, my elders and my juniors, in conclusion, is a man who sought a vision of the world. He had a dream. The dream was to dedicate his life to the liberation Frelimo, the liberation of his country, and to help the world to move one step nearer the realization of the unity of our species. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to comment on my elders, to honor a great man and his family. Thank you very much.